Well, let's turn back then to Isaiah chapter 40, verses 12 to 31. Over the past weeks, we've been looking in detail at the first half of Isaiah chapter 40, and I'd like to finish off this chapter as we come to the summer break. I'd like to finish off Isaiah chapter 40, looking at the second half. So, what do you say to Christians who are convinced that God has not only neglected them, but also actually abandoned them? Do you suggest that they need a holiday? Do you recommend that they join the local bowls club or take up a new and absorbing hobby like photography or stamp collecting? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against such things. In fact, I'm quite partial to a bit of fly fishing myself. But do you know what the prophet Isaiah does to encourage discouraged Christians? He asks them questions, loads of them, one after another, all of which are designed to make them think about God. Basically, Isaiah has one simple remedy to help discouraged believers, and he says to them, "Behold your God." Now, I'm not suggesting personally that you're in despair. One or two of you may well, in fact, be feeling that way, but that would not be the case generally. I'm pretty certain that most of us would not be in that position, but the majority of us probably are in need of the kind of encouragement that Isaiah offers here in Isaiah chapter 40. In the second half of this chapter. So for that reason, I'd like us to do exactly what the passage tells us, to do what the prophet Isaiah tells us in verse 10, and that is to behold your God. Behold your God. Well, as we take encouragement by considering who God is, and by getting our minds clear about who God is, what do we see here? Well, in verses 12 to 26, we are reminded of certain truths about God. Firstly, we are reminded about the wisdom of God. The wisdom of God. And the prophet says, no circumstance should alarm you. So, for example, in verses 13 to 14, concerning the wisdom of God, he says, "Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has taught him? With whom did he take counsel, and who instructed him, and taught him in the path of justice? Who taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding?" The expected answer each time that we're supposed to give is, well, no one instructed God. No one taught God. It's as though he is asking, so where is it that God gets his wisdom? Who is his special advisor? Who is it that goes into the courts of heaven in order to brief God on what he should be doing? The expectation is that we will kind of shuffle our feet, look down at the floor, clear our throats and say, well, nobody actually briefs God. See, sometimes I do wonder whether in the back of our minds, even as Christians, there are times when we have this kind of nagging idea that maybe God doesn't understand everything, that maybe he doesn't understand, for example, modern technology. And yet if you really think it through and you think biblically about the character of God, then you have to conclude that God actually knows what Microsoft has planned for next year. God actually knows more about the Xbox than the man who invented the Xbox, presumably Mr. X. It's as though Isaiah is saying, you do believe this, don't you? In other words, God makes his plans according to his infinite wisdom, and that means no circumstance should alarm you. God is not caught by surprise. God is not taken by surprise in the events that we've passed through in recent months. Now, that doesn't rule out the fact that sometimes you face circumstances that may disturb you, that may perplex you, that may discourage you. But if you really believe that God knows all things and that He is the very source of all wisdom and all knowledge, that it all comes from Him, then no circumstance that you face ought to alarm you. But just because you face situations that are difficult to fathom, and there are those times, there are circumstances in our lives, even as Christians, that we struggle to understand. But just because you face situations sometimes that are incomprehensible to you, situations that leave you scratching your head and wondering, but how can God allow this? It doesn't mean that God doesn't understand, or that God doesn't know the answers, or that somehow God has been caught off guard. See, in verse 14 we read that no one needs to teach God the path of justice. So when bad things happen that we don't understand, and we wonder how God can allow such things to happen, then don't allow that to rob you of the reality that God in His profound wisdom understands those things from the very beginning to the end. After all, have you not read those words in Isaiah chapter 55 that remind you that God's ways are higher than your ways, His thoughts higher than your thoughts? If God is all wise, if this is the wisdom of God, if His wisdom is infinite, then no circumstance should alarm you. That's the first thing. The second thing that Isaiah reminds us of is this. He reminds us of the immensity of God, so that no idol should seduce you. Let me explain. See, think about the immensity of God that Isaiah refers to in verses 12 and verses 22. God is above all creation. He's not confined within the limits of His created universe. God created all things, but He's not held captive within His creation. Neither did He create everything and then sort of leave it to run its course, like an absentee landlord or something. If He held all, and if He holds all the oceans of the world in His hand, if God can uproot the mountains of the world and weigh them in a set of weighing scales, He must be very big, don't you think? But why does Isaiah put it like this? After all, you and I know that this kind of language sounds almost poetic. It's like his imagination is running wild as he writes under the leading of the Holy Spirit. But why? Why does he write in such fantastic terms? Well, the reason is that he deliberately writes like this because it is not enough simply to tell us the facts. To illustrate that, let me illustrate that at my own expense. I remember many years ago memorizing parts of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, one of the great creeds or confessions of the Christian Church, one of the great catechisms of the Christian Church drawn up in the 1600s. It's a truly wonderful summary of biblical truth, and I warmly commend it to you. But the aim of the Shorter Catechism, the aim isn't just to inform our minds, but it's to make our hearts sing as well. But the danger is that we simply memorize it as a summary of the Christian faith that we can then recite, parrot fashion, without our hearts being engaged, and it becomes purely academic. Now, I remember being struck by one of the opening questions in the Shorter Catechism, which asks, who is God? And the answer is that God is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in His being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. And one day I quoted it, many, many years ago. I quoted it in prayer when I was praying in the pulpit. And not because I was trying to show that I'd memorized it, but because I thought it would be a real encouragement for people to be reminded about who God is. But I think I must have just recited it sort of parrot fashion. I must have trotted out the words, because a few days later, one of the elderly men in the church sort of sidled up to me and he said, you know, he says, we do have to be careful that we don't talk about the attributes of God as though we're reading the football results. Well, you know, I took the point and it went to my heart. I think that's what Isaiah is doing here. He's addressing us. He's addressing God's people in distressing circumstances. And for such people, it's not enough to say to them, well, how can you be so distressed? After all, you know your doctrine. You know the truth that God is omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. You know, God is present everywhere. He knows all things. He can do all things. You know that. So what are you getting so worried about, anxious about? So Isaiah is, what he's doing, he's getting our imaginations deliberately to run riot by painting a picture of the sheer grandeur of God. He's assaulting our minds with something of the grandeur of God, with the immensity of God in all his greatness. Because there are times in our lives as Christians when what we know of God in our heads doesn't always move our hearts or doesn't always help us to face difficult circumstances. And at such times we need our imaginations to be fired up and our hearts drawn to worship as we contemplate the sheer immensity of who God is. Can you see that? Do you know he does the same thing in verses 18 to 20 in connection with, for example, idolatry? Now you know that the Israelites, they were surrounded by pagan nations who worshipped gods of their own making, and they found it an aid to worship. They found it helpful in worship to make an image of their God. So they would cut down a tree and they would carve it into the shape of their God. They would cover it with gold or silver, and then they would bow down and worship it. And that's how they approached God. And although for us, we think this is not relevant to us in our culture, if you put yourself in the situation where everybody around you is kind of religious and is worshipping some kind of a god in that way, don't you think it would be very easy to start having a few doubts and beginning to think, maybe it's me that's wrong? Israel was supposed to be the only people in the entire world who didn't use images as aids to worship. And everyone else was using images to worship their God. And no wonder they were beginning, in their perplexity and in the face of an onslaught by the Assyrians, no wonder they began having doubts. And that's why he goes on in verses 21 and 22 to reassure us that the true and living God whom we worship cannot be contained in a carved image, no matter how beautiful that image may be. And some of those carved images, well, some of them were pretty ugly, but some of them probably were quite attractive as well. Let me give you an example. Last summer, I took my wife for the first time to Myanmar, mainly to meet church leaders and other friends that I know, though I didn't kid myself or my wife into thinking it was going to be a holiday. But we met up with friends, and in Yangon we spent some time with a very dear friend of mine who's a national Burmese church leader. And he asked me, he said, while you're here, he said, are there any tourist places that you would like to take your wife to visit? He knew that I'd been there several times before and met with him many an occasion. But he asked me, he said, are there any tourist sites you want to go to? And I said, well, the only one that I can really think of, I'd love to take my wife to the Swindon Pagoda in Yangon. Not because it's a place of Buddhist worship, but purely because, quite frankly, it is so historic and it is just so spectacular as a place to visit. culturally. Well, our friend, this church leader, he phoned up in advance, and because he was so well known, by the time we got there, the reception, the receiving committee had been laid on to welcome us, and we were treated quite literally. We were visiting VIPs. I've been to the Swindon Pagoda as a tourist, but never treated as a VIP. In fact, we were shown around personally by a retired Burmese military general with a whole entourage of attendants, including the police, following him. And as he showed us around, one of the most priceless objects of worship in the Swindon Pagoda that he took us to is a large statue of the Buddha made entirely from one piece of jade. And it's contained within this huge glass case, heavily guarded. So the orders were given and the case was unlocked, and we stepped up onto the plinth and stepped in through the glass case, and the general, this retired general, invited us to come inside with him, lay our hands upon this jade Buddha and pray. Now I was understandably a little bit uncertain about all of this, and I waited to see what my church leader friend would do, and he cautiously did put his hands on the Buddha and closed his eyes and began to pray, and so I did exactly the same. In fact, talking with him afterwards, I think we probably prayed pretty much the same thing. We prayed that people there would become Christians. And when we looked up, there was a large crowd of tourists, all looking and wondering who on earth we were to be allowed the privilege of going inside and laying our hands on this absolutely priceless jade Buddha. But you know, when you think about it, it's ridiculous, isn't it? It's a lump of stone, albeit very expensive stone. Do you see how ridiculous this is? And that's what Isaiah is saying here in verses 21 and 22. He's saying, consider the immensity of God, of the God whom we know and love and worship, the immensity of the true and living God. And so no idol should seduce you, however beautiful they may be, whether it's the jade Buddha in Yangon or whether it's the emerald Buddha that I've also seen in Bangkok. Ultimately, they're just lumps of stone. If God is so immense and so glorious and so infinitely beautiful, why on earth would your hearts go hankering after other gods, mere lumps of stone, or whatever it is that your heart happens to go hankering after and lusting after? If God is this majestic, no other gods will attract you. But then thirdly, Isaiah reminds us of the supremacy of God, and he says no enemies can destroy you. Think about the supremacy of God, even in the political realm, he says, verses 23 and 24. Sometimes we think that anything to do with God has got to be religious, and that somehow that God is not interested in things like the conduct of nations and the political situation. And yet, according to Isaiah, God is even in control of the political situation, even when it doesn't look that way. God is in control. He controls nations. But why does Israel need to be reminded of this? Well, I tell you, it's because the days are coming when other nations, notice verses 15 and 17, verses 15 and 17, other nations, when powerful rulers, verses 23 and 24, are going to be dominating the people of Israel. Now, at the time of Isaiah, the Assyrian Empire was in the ascendancy and was beginning to expand and becoming a threat to Israel as a rapidly growing superpower. And Isaiah is saying that a time is coming when Assyria will, under the rule of Sennacherib, will invade Israel. Sennacherib will capture the northern kingdom of Israel, and he will capture parts of the southern kingdom, even powerful cities like Lachish. Although God will intervene and safeguard the city of Jerusalem under the reign of Hezekiah. But let me tell you, the Assyrians were really not very nice people, you see. Go to the British Museum if you're not sure, and you'll find out there. You'll discover what the Assyrians were like. So if you knew that you were about to be invaded by a vast army of soldiers who literally skinned their enemies alive, wouldn't you have reason to be just a little bit anxious? Wouldn't you want to know what God thinks about all this? And that's what Isaiah tells us in verses 23 and 24. He tells us what God thinks about the nations of the world, including the Assyrians and the powers of this world. It's not that God plays down the significance of nations that God is calling his people from and will call his people from among, but rather he does play down the arrogance of the nations. So in verse 24, he says, "Scarcely shall they be planted, scarcely shall they be sown, scarcely shall their stock take root in the earth, when he will also blow on them, and they will wither, and the whirlwind will just take them away like stubble." Isaiah is saying that some of these great rulers and world dictators like Sennacherib and in days to come Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon, they seem to be invincible, but their apparent power is always short-lived. Really, relatively short-lived. God will just blow. The Spirit of God will blow them away like chaff. Scarcely shall they be planted, sown or planted in the earth, but God will just blow, and he will blow them away like dust. You know, I'm sure that many of us can vividly remember seeing the video footage from April 2003. Remember when the statue of Saddam Hussein was pulled down to the ground and it broke? It shattered like a piece of pottery. So how pathetic the whole thing was. Evil rulers will have their day, but it will be short-lived, whoever they may be. And such rulers are alive and well in various countries today. In fact, such rulers are alive in countries today where they persecute the people of God, where believers, where Christians suffer for the sake of Jesus Christ. And to all of us it seems so terribly unjust, and we wonder why God doesn't intervene and do something. Well, the fact is, you see, is that he will, but he may not do it when we think he should. But it will be, as far as God is concerned, it will be just the right time, and it will be soon enough. We read in the book of Proverbs that the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord, and like a river he turns it whichever way he chooses. And if God is in control of the political powers that be, then we can be assured that no regime can destroy you. But fourthly, notice that we see something else here. We see the detail of God, such that no vastness can obscure you. We see not only God's grandeur and his majesty and in his greatness, but we also see how amazingly detailed, how incredibly thorough God is as well. You know, it's like that song that we sometimes sing. Indescribable, uncontainable. You place the stars in the sky and you know them by name. You are amazing, God. Now, I understand that on a very clear night, or at least I'm told, I gather that the human eye on a very clear night can see something like 2,000 stars in the sky. Maybe there has to be maybe if you're somewhere where there's very little light pollution. But if you think that even just with the eyes that you can, the stars that you can see with the naked eye, if you think that God not only created them, vast as they are, but that he knows each one by name, that's pretty impressive. But I'm also told that at the present time, using modern technology, using the most powerful equipment that scientists know of, we're aware of the existence of about 50 billion stars, apparently. 50 billion stars. And according to Isaiah, God knows each one of them by name. He made the stars also. That is just an indication of the amazing detail of God. And what that means is that God is not only immense, but he's also intimate. If God knows the name of every single star in the universe, billions of billions of billions times 10 to the power of who knows what, then how much more does he know you by name? And if God knows the name of every single star, it means that you can rest assured that you are not going to get somehow lost in the system. In fact, that truth was captured so beautifully in the words that I read at the beginning of the service in Psalm 147. In Psalm 147 verse 4 we read that he counts the number of the stars, he calls them all by name. Isn't that beautiful? And it speaks of God's immensity. That is truly amazing. But just look at the previous verse, verse 3 in Psalm 147. He not only counts all and knows every star by name, but verse 3, he heals the brokenhearted and he binds up their wounds. And you see, that speaks not only of God's immensity, but of his intimacy. The God who knows the individual names of 50 billion stars is also the God who stoops to heal the brokenhearted and to bind up your wounds. The implication is that no vastness can obscure you. God is not so vast that he does not care about you. So, isn't this a word of real encouragement to us? We see here the wisdom of God, that no circumstance should alarm you. We see the immensity of God, no idol should seduce you. We see the supremacy of God, no enemies can destroy you. We see the detail of God, or the intimacy of God. No vastness can obscure you. These are the truths about God that Isaiah wants us to focus our minds and our hearts upon as God's people. At times when we might be tempted to think that God has somehow abandoned us. And all of that is here in verses 12 to 26. Now, a word of application. Verses 27 to 31. In verses 27 to 31, Isaiah applies this truth to our hearts, and he tells us these two things. Firstly, in verses 27 to 29, that he is the mighty God who sustains you. Now, if you believe all that you've just read and heard about in verses 12 to 26, then you have to come to this conclusion. Whatever your circumstances might be like right now, whatever your circumstances are, God is limitless in his power. That does not change because of your circumstances at this moment. We are reminded in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 5 that we are kept by the power of this God. God's power will never run out. Sometimes we hear the prophets of doom on television telling us that, a day is coming when the sun will run out of energy and we'll all be burned up and all the rest of it. Well, I don't know whether that's true or not. But even if it is, who cares? Because God's power will never run out. He will keep us till the river rolls its waters at our feet. And then he will keep us through the unending ages of eternity. How different he is from the idols of the nations all around. Dumb idols that have to be carried around, made in the image of man, that have to be made by human hands and carried around, images that are utterly powerless to help us. But our God is the mighty God who sustains us. But also, not only is he the mighty God who sustains us, but in verses 30 and 31, we are the believing people who trust him. Do you see, we may not be the most impressive people outwardly. We don't always look, let's be honest, we don't always look too impressive, do we? There are times when we doubt and we question, and we quite rightly voice our complaints to God. Sometimes when we despair of our circumstances, when we frequently despair of ourselves and we are disappointed in ourselves. In ourselves, we're very weak and frail. We're not always the victorious, triumphant believers that we like to think that we are. But we keep on trusting God, believing that having begun a good work in us, that he will bring it to completion in the day of Christ Jesus, such that nothing, but nothing, will separate us from the love of God in Christ. So we keep on trusting him. God keeps on sustaining us, giving power to the weak, strength to those who are weary. And he will keep on doing that. He will keep on doing so until the Lord Jesus comes or calls us home.